Today we're going to talk about open source security, but specifically, I was trying to come up with what was a very practical thing that we could talk about and demonstrate and learn how to do using open source tools that's really going to give us, something that we can take home and use. And obviously, it's going to provide some security for us. So you may have heard of reverse proxies. You may have not. You may not have heard of reverse proxies. We're specifically going to set one up using Nginx today. But before we talk about how to do that, I want to talk about what a reverse proxy does not do. So we'll talk specifically about how it actually works, but it's really important to know that this is not the end-all security tool in the open source quiver or in technology in general, because things like an SQL vulnerability in your application, the reverse proxy is going to, get the stuff from, I think I can get a pen here. So we have, the web here, and this is, where all evil things happen, blah, blah, blah. If you get a request and it comes through your router and then goes through your reverse proxy to your server, and there is an SQL vulnerability on your server, the reverse proxy server will quite happily transmit that vulnerability back and forth. It's not going to protect you from an application level security issue. Okay, so it's not a way to protect everything inside of your network from evil things on the cloud. It's just one tool that does a few different things. Now, this open source tool that we're using today, again, it's Nginx. There are other open source tools that will do reverse proxy, like Apache. You can set up a reverse proxy with Apache. But there are other tools, like Microsoft, for example, has reverse proxying tools. And so this could be a Microsoft box. And it could be using something like, you've probably heard of Threat Management Gateway. I think there's a whole bunch of other initials that Microsoft has now. I think it was replaced with something called ISA. There's security tools, and they do reverse proxying. They also have firewalling built in, and they can sniff application traffic, and they can do other things. But one of the big things that those products will do is provide a reverse proxy. All right, so what does a reverse proxy do if it doesn't save us from application level vulnerabilities? Well, it does a few things. How it actually works is a request comes in from, let me turn on my pen. Let's get a different color because that was pretty harsh looking. I'll get green. Okay, so a request comes in from the internet, comes into our router through, let's say we have a single IP address. The Nginx reverse proxy takes that request and it says, okay, you're looking for my blog server. And then it takes a request to the blog server, and the blog server says, oh, somebody wants to see the blog, and it returns the blog to the Nginx reverse proxy. It goes out through the web and back to the person who is requesting it. Now, it might seem like you're just adding one silly step, but it does something pretty cool. So where the security comes in, this is where, I have a problem with my pen today. We're going to use red because this is where like the firewall is, right? Generally at the router level, we have a firewall. And this firewall is going to, just allow a single port to come through. But when a request comes in, they're going to see an Nginx web server. That's what they're going to see, or an Nginx proxy server, but they're going to see Nginx even if your backend server is really running Windows. And sometimes this comes into play if you have an older server or an older embedded application that you really can't update and secure. If you can put a reverse proxy in there, it anonymizes that traffic. So the people on the internet don't know that you're running, Windows NT. They don't know that is what the service that they're accessing is actually running on. What they see is this Nginx proxy machine, and that's what they interface. They just interface with the proxy, and the proxy interfaces with the server. And that allows you that anonymizing backend. It can also do things like load balancing. So you can have one Nginx, proxy server, and you can have multiple computers in the back. You can have, server 1, server 2, server 237, and it can say, okay, I've sent one connection here, I'm going to send one here, I'm going to send one here. We're going to do things a little bit differently today. Again, it's very flexible. This is some of the things they can do. What we're going to do is solve a problem. And of course, we also get the security features like I talked about with this, but we're solving a problem when you're trying to access multiple computers behind a single router or a single IP address on your network. And so that's where we're going to introduce you to Frederick. Okay, so here's Frederick. Here's the guy over here. He's wearing glasses. I'd like to say he looks like me, but Frederick has more hair than I do. So Frederick is inside a local LAN. Okay, so we're inside a LAN right now, and inside his LAN, he can access these 3 different servers. Now you'll see this server up here. It's a DNS name. It has a DNS name of Pookie. Now, I'm a Garfield fan, so a lot of my stuff has to do with Garfield. But Pookie is the name of the server. When he goes to HTTP Pookie, he gets directly to that because he's on the same LAN. Now, the same thing with this server. It's at this IP address, 192.168.1.5. So when he goes to that IP address, he gets that web server. And then down here as well, when he accesses this server, notice this one is on port 8000. Okay, so this is actually a different port, but he can still directly connect to it because he's on the same LAN. Hopefully that makes sense. These are just multiple servers inside, the building that he works or the school that he attends, so he can access them all directly. The problem happens when he is outside. And this is the problem that we're going to solve. Because here we have a router, right? This is the router that has a single IP address that's facing the outside world. So when he's home, that's the only IP address that he can hit. Now, you can do a couple things to access multiple servers inside your network. One, you can just forward port 80, because that's the web traffic port is port 80. I'm going to try to draw an 80 here, and it's going to be really ugly. Wow, okay, that's great. I'm not using a pen, I'm using a mouse, if you couldn't guess. But port 80 can be transferred and open a pinhole in the firewall so that port 80 traffic goes right to this 192.168.1.5. Okay? Now you could also open up port 8000. Oh, wow. You should not draw with a mouse. But port 8000, you could open up another pinhole so that he can access, this single IP address, port 8000, and then get to this server. The problem is, what about this one up here? He wants to get to the Pookie server, but if, it's already forwarded port 80 into this 192.168.1.5. Well, that's a problem because you can only forward port 80 to one internal computer. So he's either going to be able to access this 1.5 or Pookie, but he can't access both of them on a single IP address using port 80. And that's a real problem because sometimes there are multiple things inside his network that he wants to do. And then there's another problem too. If you start poking all of these holes into your firewall, you don't want to open up, port 80 and port 8000 and there's another server, so let's make that on port 623 and there's another port, so let's do that on port 8888. You don't want to open up all of these holes in your firewall. Ideally, you want to have the least number of ports going through your firewall that you can possibly have because you want to protect your internal network. So, a reverse proxy is a great solution. And here we go. Here's how it works using a reverse proxy. So we still have the same servers. This one is name-based. It's called Pookie. It's accessed on port 80. This is 192.168.1.5 on port 80, and this is 192.168.1.17 on port 8000. Here is our reverse proxy. Now it sits behind the firewall. The firewall is right here. And here is our router. So Frederick is at home, and he needs to access all 3 of these servers. So what the proxy does is it just creates a virtualized name-based website. So it uses name-based virtualization, just like you can set up virtual hosts on a web server. It's virtual hosting, but they're reverse proxies. And it uses just the single IP, and they all use port 80. So that means we only have to open up the single port in our firewall to get back and forth. And the proxy will then point to the internal servers based on whatever name Frederick asks for on the outside. Hopefully that makes sense. And I do have a demo, but I want to describe what our demo is going to be like because it's starting to get complicated. Like, oh my goodness, look at all these arrows. So what we're going to do is we're going to have these 3 servers. They're actually set up. We'll look at those. I have those set up on my network already. They're just very simple web servers. This Pookie server is running on port 80, and it responds when you go to Pookie. This one's on IP-based, and it responds on port 80. This is IP-based, and it goes on port 8000. And what we're going to do is we're going to use names, DNS names, blue, purple, and green. All right, and we're going to, those all map to the single IP address that is on the Nginx server. However, when Frederick says, I would like http://blue, it's going to get the website from this Nginx server because that's its IP address. And the Nginx server is saying, you want blue? I will give you Pookie. And Frederick says, hey, I want http://purple. And then the Nginx server says, you want purple? I will give you 192.168.1.5. And the same thing with this green. If you go to http green, it's going to give you that. It's only using the single IP address, and it's only using the single port 80, but it's allowing us to access all those multiple services behind the single IP address. All right. Hopefully that makes sense as to what we're doing and what exactly is going on. But we're going to actually do the demo now, because that's where the fun really comes into play, is the demo. So Frederick, you stay here. We'll maybe come back to you to clarify after the fact. But let's switch over to my computer. Okay, so the scenario that I just described is laid out here, and I made shortcuts on here just to show you. So 192.168.1.17. that is running a web server. If I click on that, the green background here says I'm running a server on this IP address, and I'm running on port 8000. Notice that it's at port 8000 up here in the URL. If we click on the shortcut link to 192.168.1.5, you notice there's no port, which means it's port 80 because that's the default port. And it says I'm server this, and I'm running on port 80. And then, of course, Pookie is name-based. If we go to HTTP Pookie, it says I'm the Pookie server, and I'm running on port 80. So that is awesome. Now this machine that we're sitting on is going to be our Nginx reverse proxy, which means that we're going to access we're going to point, that single IP address is going to be 127.0.0.1. It's going to be our local host. But right now there's nothing installed on this server. We go to localhost, it's going to say, dude, there's no server running here. You can't access localhost at all. Same thing with all of these various URLs here. Although, see how it's blue, green, purple? If we come over to the command line and we ping blue, it is already mapped. So the DNS name is set up, 127.0.0.1. So the DNS name is actually all set up. And if you want to see where I did that, it's in etc. hosts. All I did is add purple, green, and blue into this DNS hosts file, which allows us to quickly add a DNS entry in here. That's just a little bonus cool thing that you can do if you're on Linux. But anyway, clear this screen. What we need to do is install Nginx on our machine so that we can tell Nginx which machines we want to point to in the background. So first things first, sudo apt-get install. You have to spell install correctly. Install Nginx. My password. It's going to install. Good, my internet connection is working. It's going to install. It's installed everything properly. It's working. And now we should have Nginx running. Let's see. If we click on localhost, haha, welcome to Nginx. So we have a web server running, but we want to set up reverse proxies with these names on them that are going to point to this single IP address and redirect it into the background. So let's go into etc. Nginx. Now inside here, if you're not familiar with Nginx, it's configured a lot like Apache, but it's going to be in the etc. Nginx folder. I'm running, this is Ubuntu 16.04 that I'm running. This is the Mate version, but this is Ubuntu. You can do this on Debian, you can do this on CentOS. I'm just a Ubuntu fan, so I'm using Ubuntu. But inside here, you'll notice there's this cool file that they give us. It's called Proxy params. Let's look at that really quick because I want to show you Proxy params, that there's a set of configuration directives that we are going to have to add for our virtual host in order to turn it into a reverse proxy. Now the nice thing is it's already set up here, right? We can just include this file and have these settings in place. So proxy set header, host, HTTP host. There are a lot of other options that could be added into here, but we are doing the most basic level of reverse proxying, and so we can just use the default stuff that they include in that file. So let's quit out of here. Just if you want to look at these really quick though, it's doing like a forwarding the proxy, and it'll say, it's proxying for what external IP address and where is it going to and what IP address should I give it as the remote address. So it gives the internal server a bunch of information, and that's just inside this proxy params file. What we're going to do is we're going to set up a new website. Now normally we would put it inside sites available, and then we would create a symbolic link to the sites enabled folder. I'm just going to go right into sites enabled, And inside here, we'll see a default. I'm just going to create them in here to save the time of linking and doing symbolic linking. So if it's inside the sites enabled folder, it's going to be an active site. So let's actually start by creating a file. So sudo vi. Let's do the first one and call it blue.conf. All right, so here we have Blue. I'm using VI as my editor because I've done it for like 25 years, but whatever editor you like, just know that you're going to have to use sudo privileges in order to edit these. So I'm using VI, and what we need to do is create a virtual host file. Just like if we were creating a virtual web host file, it's configured the same way, but instead of sending web pages to the user, it's redirecting it in the background using that reverse proxy mechanism to a different server. All right, so we need to configure it just like a virtual host. So server, open brackets, listen on port 80. Again, 80 is the default web port. That's the port that we want it to listen on for incoming connections. Server underscore name. And this is where we say, okay, you're going to be requesting a website from my single IP address. But it's important to know that when a web browser asks for a website, it asks for it by name. So even though it's going to be connecting to 127.0.0.1, that request is also going to include the name of the website that it wants. In our case, that's going to be Blue. The server name is just Blue. That's a DNS name, and that's what we're going to be requesting. So server name is Blue. Put a couple spaces here. Now we have to say, okay, what do I want to happen when we actually, we've just set up a website here. It's named Blue. I'm listening on port 80. What do I want it to do when it connects? Well, when it connects to the location / like the root of the quote unquote website, we want it to do the following. So we're going to open brackets, and inside the brackets we're going to say proxy underscore pass, and then where we want it to redirect to. We want it to, and I guess redirect is a bad name, where we want it to funnel the traffic to and from, because it's not just like handing it off, it's actually going, all of the traffic is going through this Nginx server. So our proxy pass, we're going to say I want to send it to http:// and let's see, Blue was Pookie, so Pookie, and that is where I want it to go. Semicolon at the end of every line of the configuration here. All right, and now we need to say include, etc., Nginx, proxy, params. I think it was underscore. So proxy params. That's the name of that file that contains those few lines. Now we could just copy and paste that in. If we wanted to just open up that proxy params file and copy the text and paste it right in here instead of using an include file, we could, but it's cleaner if we just include the proxy params file from the etc. Nginx folder. So we do that. We're going to close this location stanza, and now we actually need to close the entire server stanza. And this Vim actually does a nice job of highlighting what we're closing. So we've created a virtual host that is named Blue. It's listening on port 80, and at the root level, it's going to pass all of the requests to an internal server called Pookie. And of course, we've included those parameters from that proxy params file. So let's save this. Awesome. And now if we do sudo service nginx restart, okay, it's restarted. Now let's go to a web browser and see how it worked. Now let's actually clear everything. I'm going to clear all recent history so we're not getting any cached information. And we have a blank screen here. All right, so if we go to Pookie, we know that we're going to get that blue screen that says Pookie. But what if we go to HTTP Blue now? Because remember before it said there's nothing running here. But now if we go to Blue, which resolves to the local host, boom, it actually takes us and gives us the Pookie information. It says I'm the Pookie server, I'm running on port 80, but look up here. It's actually http://blue, which we know resolves to this computer itself, right? It's resolving to 127.0.0.1. It's not resolving to Pookie's address. However, because we've set up that reverse proxy, it's now going through Nginx, and Nginx is retrieving the site and bringing it back to us. Let's quickly do the other ones. And actually, let's just copy because I'm lazy, right? Let's say copy blue.conf to purple.conf and sudo copy blue.conf to green.conf. And now if we look in here, we have all of these websites available, but we do need to edit it. We did blue already, so let's look at green. Sudo vi green.conf, and now we still want it to listen on port 80. Remember, we only want to have to put that one hole through our firewall. So port 80, but we want it to go to the DNS name of green. And here we want not to pass it to Pookie, but we want to pass it to, do you remember what the green one was? 192.168.1.17. And we're actually taking it to a whole different port 8000. All right, so we're going to save this one. So does this make sense? It's listening on port 80 for somebody asking for the website called green, and what it's going to give to them is this website on this port. So we'll save that, and we'll quickly do one more, vi purple.conf. Now the server name is going to be, you probably figured this out, purple. And this time, instead of going to Pookie, we're going to go to 192.168.1.5, which is a completely different computer altogether. It's a completely different system. Not the one that we're on, but that's where it's going to direct us. So we'll save this one. Sudo service nginx restart. Okay, and now the moment of truth. All right, so we know that blue works. We click on blue and we get the Pookie server. What if we click on green? We click on green and now it says I'm the server on 192.168.1.17 and I'm running on port 8000. However, look up here. There's no port 8000. This is just http://green, and this is just connecting to Nginx. Nginx in the background is connecting to the other web server across the network. And of course, purple should work the same way unless I did a typo. Boom. I'm server 192.168.1.5 running on port 80, but of course we know that we're just getting information directly from Nginx because purple resolves to our Nginx server, not this IP address. Hopefully that makes sense. And look, localhost is now responding. It says welcome to Nginx, but localhost is not one of these DNS names, so of course it doesn't give us anything other than the default Nginx website. We can have all of these reverse proxies live right alongside a standard website. Nginx is very powerful and very flexible and allows us to do all of that with one single IP address that we can poke through our server. So I'm getting close on time. Let's go back and stop sharing. Cool. Okay, so hopefully everybody sees this now. And now let's see if this makes sense. Now we did it. Let's see if it makes sense. So over here, Frederick says, give me http://blue. We connected using our server, or we connected using our single IP address. My pen isn't working. There we go. We connected to the Nginx server on 127.0.0.1. But because we were asking for blue, it said, oh, I have a reverse proxy configured for that, so I'm going to reach out to Pookie, and that's the information I'm going to send you. Same thing with purple. It reached out and gave us this website. And then even with green, even though it was on a different port number on this side, over here, it's all still on port 80. And it says, you want this on port 8000, I'll get that, and then I'll return this to you. So we're able to serve a whole bunch of different servers using a single IP address and a single port going through the firewall. So that's just one of the multiple things that Nginx can do to make your system that much more flexible, but also that much more secure, because again, it's hiding what kind of server is back here. All they see is this computer right here. All they see is the Nginx server, and that's what they point to. So anyway, Nginx is awesome. I urge you to play with it because you know what? It's completely free. It's open source. It's very powerful. I like to use Nginx as my reverse proxy as opposed to setting up Apache as a reverse proxy because Nginx is so fast and so efficient. You can use a tiny little server and it will redirect traffic to, multiple servers in the background. So you can use a fairly small system here and not worry about, loading up with RAM and hard drive space and all that stuff, lots of CPU. You don't need that because it just redirects and sends traffic back and forth. So that truly is all there is to setting up Nginx. And again, I urge you to do it on your system, play with it, test it out. And even at home, let's say you can only have one port come through your firewall at home, but you want to be able to access multiple servers inside your house while you're out and about. Hey, set up a reverse proxy and you're going to be able to access all of those things based on names. It's powerful, it's awesome, and it's free. And with that, I will hand it back over to Jack because I could just talk about Nginx and stuff all day, but my time has come to an end. We didn't have any tough questions, so that's good. That means that either everybody fell asleep or I was fairly clear in what I was talking about. Normally, you would not use 127.0.0.1 as your Nginx server. Again, that's just because it's a great way to learn in a lab environment. Normally, this would be, its own computer using an IP address that you can forward into, and it would be accessing other computers on your network. But anyway, Jack, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you, everybody, for listening and paying attention. I hope this was helpful.